after the French and Indian War, or as it's called in Europe, the 7 Years' War, Britain was at peace for the first time really in over 50 years. But they were also broke, and they were in serious need of revenue. One of the things that's going to happen is they are going to redefine their relationship with the colonies in the wake of the war the colonies had started. Now, Great Britain saw taxing the colonies as the only solution to war debt. They felt the colonists were responsible for one thing. The colonial assemblies rejected this. Now, the idea was that the colonial assemblies would choose how to raise those taxes. So the taxes would so basically the colonial assemblies would be given a bill, each of the 13, and then they would come up with how to get the money. But the colonial assemblies refused to do this. Now, about this same time, England's new king, George III, has come to the throne. Now, George I and George II, as I mentioned before, did not really have much interest in being king. They liked the being rich part, but they didn't take much interest in government. George III comes to the throne, and he is insecure, and he's not particularly bright, and he is fairly desperate to prove himself, prove that he was a great man. And so he wants to become the first king in a number of generations to exert a firm control over his empire, which might have been okay, except as I mentioned before, he wasn't terribly bright and he was insecure. It's also apparently true that he suffered from a rare condition that drove him insane. In his younger years, he would go through periods of insanity. In his later years, he was just crazy all the time. In 1763, he's going to appoint a prime minister named George Grenville to help him run his empire. Now, the first issue the British want to deal with is not having another French and Indian War. The Ottawa, under their leader Pontiac, are still trying to defend the Ohio River Valley that the war was fought over, right, from British incursion. And so the British issue the Proclamation Act of 1763, which draws this line here down the Appalachian Mountains and tells the settlers they're not allowed to cross the line. But you and I both know that that desire to move west to that next open piece of land for the son who's left his father's farm, or for the new immigrant, is unstoppable, and of course the colonists will just move right in. They'll actually draw a series of these lines, just going a little bit further each time, and the colonists will ignore them all. The Mutiny Act of 1765, or also called the Quartering Act of 1765, required the colonial assemblies to raise taxes to pay for the British troops that have been stationed in America to protect America since we just started a war. The British Navy patrols the coastline, and many manufacturing industries are completely outlawed in America because they feel they're stealing money away from British manufacturing. And so, of course, the colonists are not going to like any of these provisions. The Sugar Act of 1764 establishes admiralty courts. These revoke trial by jury from smugglers. So that means that if you're caught smuggling to avoid these British taxes, you will not be tried in front of a jury of Americans who are going to be very sympathetic to you. You will be tried in front of a jury of Englishmen who will not be sympathetic to you. Or you'll just be tried in front of a British naval official who's really not going to be sympathetic to you. And so for smugglers particularly, this was a disastrous law. In that same year of 1764, the Currency Act is passed. This bans the colonies from printing any money at all, which of course is going to dramatically slow down the colonial economy. In 1765, the Stamp Act will be passed, but I'm going to get into detail on that in the next video. In the beginning, the colonists are busy fighting each other. Remember, they have more loyalty to England than they do their neighboring colony. And this tends to be an East versus West conflict, where the money is along the coast, and where the east, on the Atlantic coast. And the further you go into the country, into the west, you get poor backwoods farmers. Two examples of this would be the Paxton boys in Pennsylvania, who will rebel against high Pennsylvania taxes and move into the east and start a little war there. And then the Regulator movement in South Carolina, which would be the same thing, or North Carolina, excuse me, which would be poor Carolina farmers rejecting the taxes. But the Grenville Program, the Currency Act, the Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, and the Proclamation Act, hurt all of these groups and united them in opposition to the British program. The Westerners didn't really like it because they couldn't move west, and that's what they wanted, all that new land out there. And, of course, the Easterners didn't like it because it raised taxes on them, but it also cut down on smuggling and manufacturing, which were two ways they were making money. And, of course, nobody liked the sugar tax. So anyway, the next time we'll get into the Stamp Act and the Boston Massacre and these sorts of things. But for now, this is how it's this period in the 1763, 1764 where the colonies begin to see themselves as maybe a little more united than they thought, and the British royal government as the enemy.